Hey folks, in my last dive into Imagic's history and into what Imagic added to the TI-99 library, I looked at Fathom, which I consider a pretty great game. It came pretty late in Imagic's time in the console market, with its 2600 version getting a summer '83 release. With Fathom being Rob Phillips' last game for Imagic before his own departure, it was kind of the end of an era, given Imagic first made its name in the market with Phillips' smash hit Demon Attack. But there was another game Imagic announced for a summer '83 release I didn't talk about last time, and it also got a TI-99 for a release in its own turn. That game was Moonsweeper. Like Fathom, it was introduced to the world in Imagic's Numb Thumb News fan newsletter in spring '83, and like Fathom, it hit the market in its original 2600 version in late summer. Actually, though, Moonsweeper was scheduled for release a month earlier than Fathom, with Fathom given an August release date and Moonsweeper announced for July. Which means I did things a little out of order when I gave Fathom first dibs, but, well, guess I couldn't help it. I'm a big fan of Fathom, and I was looking forward to digging a little deeper into its background as I do. But now that that's done, it's time to give Moonsweeper whatever due it deserves, I guess, which is, some. Moonsweeper's story begins pretty similarly to Fathom's story. I'd said earlier that Fathom started as an animation by Michael Becker of a dolphin jumping out of the water. Magic's team liked that animation so much it became the basis of a game even before there was a game in the planning itself. Well, kind of similarly, Moonsweeper began with the scrolling effect involved in its orbital to surface transition, according to Bob Smith, who programmed the original 2600 version. In an interview in High Res Magazine in January '84, Bob explained it all started with this landing on a planet effect. The interview's a nice little interaction with one of Imagic's founders, incidentally, with a great little cartoon of the man himself. But my favorite quote from the interview has to be, "You won't find many Easter eggs at Imagic," which is hilarious since Imagic's games are absolutely loaded with Easter eggs. Like every single one has an Easter egg or two. I guess the writer figured that with programmers getting fair credit, there'd be no need to use Easter eggs as a way to put your mark on the product anymore, and they just wouldn't exist anymore consequently. But nope. Turns out Easter eggs are still fun even when you've got your name in the manual, which you do if you're a programmer for an Imagic title. Anyway, this business of an Imagic game basically inventing itself from some cool graphical effect that someone finagled a VCS into displaying, it's kind of a running theme with these guys. It's what you see in Cosmic Arc, which was based around a starfield effect made of graphical artifacts from a discovered exploitable glitch, and it's what we got in Fathom with the dolphin jumping animation. So no surprise that likewise the story is with Moonsweeper that this landing scroll basically invents the game. Before we move on to the ports including the TI-99 version, let's look at the original that inspired it. It's a pretty odd design all around, but it really does work, and you'd expect it to, given Bob Smith was a master of his craft and one of Imagic's top talents. Other games he was responsible for at Imagic included Dragonfire, Riddle of the Sphinx, and Star Voyager, which is to say 3 of Imagic's 9 VCS titles from their 1982 heyday. None of which make it to TI-99, unsurprisingly, given that they're pretty VCS specific in what they're trying to do. So he definitely earns his status as a member of Imagic's Holy Trinity, that being Copel, Fulop, and Smith. There are a few things that make Moonsweeper's design interesting and make it more than just another fixed space shooter in an era full of fixed space shooters. One's the ability to shoot diagonally in either phase of play, and, well, another is the fact that that's not just window dressing and it's something you need to do, since enemies approach you from either side in the orbital phase, and so just shooting straight ahead isn't going to cut it, and shooting diagonally is going to keep you safe. One more part of the recipe here is the smooth scrolling of the playfield in the second phase of play and the landing scroll that leads to it. Buck Rogers had already made it to market when Moonsweeper brought its planetary surface scroll to the 2600, so it's not the newest thing under the sun, but for me Moonsweeper's playfield scroll is the better of the two. It's smoother than Buck's, and it features better object graphics. One final novelty is the ability to fire not just forwards, but also upwards to hit the launcher ship above the planet. This will remind 99ers of Slimeoids, which has 2 versions of shooting forward in the same way, which are used in the same way by holding down to fire up on the joystick. So all in all, you can fire in 4 directions, 2 diagonals, forward, and then upward too. And at the same time, you can control your ship's speed and direction, which is, a pretty rich control scheme for a one-button game. So the 2600 version is the starting point for the title, as you usually find with Imagic's multi-platform games. But plenty of other versions were coming. Their 1983 catalog also promises versions for Intellivision, ColecoVision, VIC-20, and Atari computers. 3 of those 4 platforms never actually got their planned in-house port. The one that did was ColecoVision. But more platforms did get ports of one kind or another during Imagic's lifetime. Those included a version for MSX by Interphase Technologies, a version for Spectrum by Cheetahsoft, a version distributed by Imagic itself for Commodore 64, and the version for TI-99 4A. So we have versions that are Imagic developed and distributed, and we also have versions which are both developed and distributed by an outside party under license. Heck, in the case of several Imagic games, including this one, we have versions that are developed and distributed by Imagic initially, but distributed by an outside party subsequently. Since Activision and Telegames went on to publish several Imagic titles once Imagic left the game console market entirely. And Moonsweeper was one of those. So, which of these categories does the TI-99 version fall into? Well, unfortunately, like Demon Attack, the work was farmed out to J. Smith's Western Technologies, so the gameplay isn't Imagic's own work. You'll see the familiar Western Technologies title screen assets, which it shares with Demon Attack and Lasso, consequently. But the TI-99 4A version's situation is further complicated by the events of winter 1983. It was a complicated time for 99ers and video gamers and TI and Imagic all. TI discontinues the TI-99 4A platform in November, and it discontinues first-party marketing and distribution support for TI-99 4A software in December. After which, in January, at Winter CES, it announces that marketing and distribution support for existing Imagic titles has been passed off to Imagic itself. The Pittsburgh User Group newsletter has the full text of those announcements in its February 1984 newsletter, incidentally. So that's a good place to look for the official word on those. The upshot of this situation being that Imagic itself would be handling things as far as these titles go from there on out. TI, which had been so determined to handle its own publishing, was now passing the buck. And for all the optimistic PR jargon, this outcome just isn't at all reassuring given Imagic's own situation at this point in its history. In October, the video game market had crashed. By the end of the month, Imagic's founder, Bill Grubb, was out as CEO. In November, Enthusiast99 had reported, Imagic is having trouble getting distribution for their new products and cannot afford to advertise or produce in high volume. And this is the company that's going to be taking over distribution? I have concerns. On the one hand, Imagic had been moving in the direction of computer software for a while, so maybe this did fit at least that far. In December '83, Grubb told Enter magazine, Imagic will continue to produce software for video game systems. However, the company is dramatically stepping up development of entertainment software for quality home computers. So why not TI-99, right? Well, maybe because getting away from cartridge software and its cost was a major goal for Imagic, and their TI-99 software was cartridge software. One route they tried earlier that year in order to get away from cartridge distribution was the GameLine system. They became a launch day developer, and the only real big-name launch day developer for that platform in May. In theory, a system like that would allow them to sell games without any of the costs of manufacturing or repurchasing unsold stock, costs that had begun to ruin them in '83. Unfortunately, GameLine was a 2600-only product and not a very successful one, and the only reusable and reprogrammable cartridge platform which came to market supporting TI-99 4A, the Romox ACPC, didn't end up carrying Imagic titles. Nonetheless, plenty of Moonsweepers, Fathoms, Demon Attacks, and Microsurgeons would be available in the TI-99 4A sphere for a very long time to come. In '84, both Unisource in North America and Arcade Hardware in the UK offer the same Imagic promotional package, featuring any three Imagic games for a packaged price, suggesting that was Imagic's idea rather than one they cooked up independently and on their own separately and identically. As far as availability going forward, TechScomp makes an interesting claim following TI's departure from the market. In the August '84 issue of Home Computer Magazine, it announces that it has bought TI's remaining stock of Moonsweeper, Microsurgeon, and Demon Attack and is passing the savings on to you. At any rate, cartridges would continue to be available via the Unisource and Triton catalogs as well as other suppliers for years to come. But how thankful should we be for that? Is the world a better place for having plenty of TI-99 Moonsweeper carts in it? Or would we be better off without it? Let's look at what we got and what went into it. The starting point for what we got is, of course, the 2600 version. And as I say, that one's excellent. Like Demon Attack, it just looks and plays really well. And that's why it succeeds, not because it's got amazing new ideas or never-before-seen design features. Because it's got familiar design features it uses really well. In its October '83 issue, Video Gaming Magazine puts it nicely when they say, Moonsweeper is to video games what Return of the Jedi is to motion pictures. A magnificent telling of a story we've seen before. And in a way, that's a harder act to follow than a game with a really distinctive central gimmick or design idea. It's easier to do an adequate job at something unconventional and unexpected than to do something conventional and expected better than anybody else. And consensus was Moonsweeper was a conventional design, but exceptional in its execution. Elsewhere, Electronic Fun gave it 3.5 out of 4 in its own review, saying that even though ultimately it's a fixed shooter, the action is so intense that you hardly notice. If the TI-99 4A version of Moonsweeper was going to replicate that intense action and excellent design, it was up to Western Technologies to make that happen, since, as I'd said earlier, Imagic itself wasn't on the job and passed the buck there. Though from Imagic we do at least get most of the game's graphical assets, and these are almost completely the same as in the ColecoVision version, to the point where pattern memory and the color table seem to be arranged identically for most purposes. That being said, some pretty lazy mistakes seem to have made it into the ColecoVision version. You can see in the orbital phase of play, part of the ship's dash has random bits of planetary ring in it, though that might have been hidden by the overscan on many traditional broadcast screens. And there's a red square just hanging out in the upper left as well. Those are absent in the TI-99 version for whatever that's worth. But this also seems to be just a result of the fact that the interface doesn't really use the leftmost column, and so it's one column off-center. So they were a bit lazy about what they put there. The biggest difference between ColecoVision Atari 2600 and TI-99 versions, though, is what they do with the difficulty selection. The 2600 version lets you pick 4 difficulty levels with the Game Select switch. The ColecoVision version lets you fly to one of 4 galaxies in imitation of that. And the TI-99 version has no difficulty selection at all. Personally, I don't have a problem with any of these approaches, but picking a higher level galaxy in the ColecoVision version just gives you more red and yellow moons, and at all higher difficulties, orbital objects that, for me, move too fast to dodge. So it's fine to offer the option, I guess, but leaving it out absolutely works for me. 2 other things missing from the TI-99 version are the satellite enemy in the surface phase, and the option to use shields in the orbital phase. Those are both part of the other versions, but just missing in the TI-99 one. The missing satellite enemy doesn't affect gameplay in the surface phase much, so I'm not too worried about that. But the ability to use shields in orbit is a pretty big, pretty central feature to skip, so I'm not a fan of that being missed. One final version difference, inevitable I guess, is outside the game in the manual. Like most TI-99 4A games, Moonsweeper doesn't have as flashy a manual in its TI version, and, well, yay! For once, this is a good thing. The Atari 2600 and ColecoVision versions have an awful moon background in their manuals that doesn't want to let you read their text. And no such problem in their TI versions. A manual that doesn't make my eyes hurt. So that's nice, I guess. Oh, and as far as print materials go, definitely worth noting the advertising for Moonsweeper's 2600 version. This is the last really striking photo-composited game art Imagic put out, and it really is fantastic, so kudos to them. This is a pretty good last hurrah. And in game too, yeah, the visuals are nice, other than the satellite being absent. As for gameplay and challenge, though, there are some issues. For one, hit detection is worse than in the ColecoVision version, which already isn't perfect. Shots harmlessly passing through enemies and enemy fire passing through you is just a fact of life here. For another, your shots don't travel proportionally. We're looking out onto a horizon which extends into the distance, with closer and closer horizontal lines indicating that vertical compression of space, so shots should travel very quickly across the ground in front of you, but slowly across the distant, sprawling horizon. They do in the 2600 version, but they do not in the TI-99 4A version. This doesn't just hurt the three-dimensional illusion, it also hurts gameplay, since it means you've got enemies that move very quickly and randomly in the distance, who it takes quite a while for your shots to reach, since they move so slow as they leave your ship, making hitting distant enemies more of a roll of the dice than a matter of skill. And this is a bigger problem for the fact that trying to attack enemies from up close instead will all too often just get you killed. So the surface game strategy feels like a balancing act in which the options are shooting into the distance and hoping it hits something by random chance, or shooting a nearby enemy and hoping it doesn't shoot back. But anyway, now that I've complained about the surface phase, let's talk about the orbital phase. What is there to hopefully not complain about there? Well, first of all, what's really missing when you compare it with the 2600 version is just danger. This is a fast, dangerous screen on that version, and in the TI-99 version, it just isn't dangerous at all. You can just set up shop on the left, fire away at anything orbiting or breaking orbit, and jump aboard a passing planet whenever you feel like it. The source of this problem is really just the decision to have objects approaching on curves from above rather than on orbital diagonals from the sides. The TI-99 version's orbital phase is really just a fixed vertical shooter with objects traveling on curves. In the 2600 version, objects actually approach from the sides, so the player needs to use diagonal fire. Here, diagonal fire is kind of pointless, and there's no real danger. It's not really implementing the design. So Moonsweeper isn't the challenge you'd really hope for based on the original, and based on Imagic's other TI-99 4A work. But then it mostly isn't Imagic's work after all. It still looks good for the most part, having used Imagic's assets, but even the novelty of racing over the planet's surface into the horizon isn't all there. Unlike the 2600 version, whose speed control feels quite smooth and fluid, and unlike Buck Rogers for the TI-99 for that matter, Moonsweeper's acceleration and deceleration feels instantaneous and incremental, which is to say it doesn't really feel like acceleration and deceleration at all. So in this area, Buck beats it. Out of Demon Attack, Microsurgeon, Fathom, and Moonsweeper, which is to say out of Imagic's 4 commercially released games for TI-99 4A, I get the least out of Moonsweeper. Microsurgeon is fascinating and has a lot of replayability. Fathom is fun and pretty unique. Demon Attack lacks replayability, but makes a strong impression with its great sprites and sprite animations, and with the beta version's excellent speech. And Moonsweeper, well, as long as you don't compare it to the original or Buck Rogers, the planet scroll and the orbital graphics look pretty neat, but that's not really enough. With Moonsweeper, I'm done looking at Imagic's released titles, and next time I'll be looking at Imagic's only surviving unreleased game for TI-99, one I'm pretty passionate about, Wing War. Thanks for watching, folks. Tell me what you think about Moonsweeper or Imagic's other games in the comments, and have a good one.